Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest this week is Dee Smith, the CEO of the Strategic Insight Group. The Strategic Insight Group is kind of an interesting company. It's a global private intelligence agency that serves large investors. Dee is a frequent contributor to podcasts and shows and one of the most interesting people I've ever come across. So, Dee, thank you for being here.
Well, you're very kind. I appreciate the kind words, and I'm happy to be here. And there's lots to discuss in the world today. So,
Yeah, I just to give the listeners context, I first came across your thinking, man, 5 or 6 years ago now, when you were appearing on Real Vision, and I put a note in my head at that time, like, man, I would love to meet Dee sometime because you were talking about such fascinating topics, sort of the intersection of politics and big ideas and historical trends, and so full circle, here we are today, and excited to have this conversation. I think a good place maybe to start would be Ukraine, right? We just had this terrorist attack in Russia. There's 1 million homes apparently that are without power in Ukraine. And not to start with too broad of a question, but what's going on in Ukraine?
well, I would prefer to answer that as what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, because let's take them as you just did, take them together. So, you know, I guess the place to start is to think about what just happened in Russia and what it means. And one of the things it means is that I think people continue to underestimate how wildly inefficient and ineffective the Russian bureaucracy is and the Russian security service is. In some ways, they're very good at using brute force and arresting people and putting them in prisons, and and as we've seen with the perpetrators, the alleged perpetrators of this attack in Moscow, treating them with great brutality. One of them was apparently force fed his own ear, and so things like that. That's typical behavior for centuries in Russia, and I think that people, and this is now going to get very quickly into a broader topic, but we can come back to it. But it's directly germane to answering your question. People believed in the 1990s that the fall of the Soviet Union meant that Russia was going to become part of the West, and that it was this so-called Washington Consensus, this moment of the end of history, as Fukuyama called it, that all other systems had failed and Western liberal capitalism was going to prevail. And because of that idea, people rushed at pell-mell speed to privatize Russia. And even Milton Friedman, who was the great person who was the great exponent of privatization and an interpretation of what companies are for, which is just to make money. And we can talk about that too. But he has recounted before he died that he had been asked what should Russia do, and his answer, he said, was privatize, privatize, privatize. And in fact, he then said, "But I was wrong." And this kind of single point, single line view of history is almost always wrong. That there's one prescription, there's one thing to do, there's one simple answer to everybody's problems. And so what happened in Russia over the last 25, 30 years is that government bureaucrats became kleptocratic oligarchs, and they used political connections to buy up everything as it was privatized, and began to threaten Putin, who was, we'll go into Yeltsin and Putin, and that's a whole other story. But this began to be seen as a threat by let's say the central government, which was really Putin. And so what he did was begin to invoke the earlier forms of oppressive Russian governance. And he also got more scared and I think paranoid. I mean, this is a man who is now afraid of a shaman in Siberia. I mean, he's out there, and he began to imprison or essentially eject um, any oligarchs who were getting too big for their britches, who were too powerful, who were making noises against him, and basically came up with a uh, you could say this was never an official policy, but it was what was going on. That if you don't screw with me, Putin said, you can keep what you stole. And so this started down a path which is very resonant of earlier things in Russia, to assert more and more control over society and over business people and over the entirety of you know the Russian realm. And Putin has called the end of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical tragedy, I think is the word he actually used, of the 20th century. So this is, and there's some things that would be interesting to relate to Xi Jinping too about this. But staying on Russia, um, he began to develop some very grandiose ideas about what the place of Russia was in the world, and he began to listen a lot to certain philosophers and thinkers in Russia, who basically said that Russia is that the West and other nations that are seafaring nations are corrupt because they interact with so many places and bring back other ideas and they don't remain pure. Dugin is one of these philosophers. And Russia should remain pure as a land based country. And taking that to heart, he then began to develop these theories about the role of the greater Russian world, the Rus as they call it, and that led him to Ukraine, because Russian civilization started in Ukraine with the Kievan Rus about 1,000 years ago, almost exactly 1,000 years ago, when the Kievan kings decided to copy Byzantium and to adopt Orthodox Christianity. And it then spread into Russia. I mean, it happened at the same time in Kiev and Moscow, but Kiev is central because of Vladimir, the person who was kind of the leader of this movement. And so, invoking that history, he said, really, Ukraine is part of Russia, and really, we need to make sure that it remains so. And this was connected to all these ideas, but also to the threats that he felt from the West and the liberal democratic order of the West and so forth. So, fast forward, he writes this miserably long document, which I actually read about 3 years ago, 5,000 words or more, about why the Russian state needed to take over the Ukrainian state and make sure that it remained part of Russia. And it was filled with all sorts of crazy ideas. I mean, some not crazy ideas in the sense that they're historically true, but they're not relevant. And the Ukrainians have essentially moved on. Their language is different. It's sort of in the way that, Spanish and Italian are different, or Spanish and Portuguese. They're related, but it's different. And they've moved on. They're not interested in that. But Putin is. And then add to that the fact that the culture of stealing has been, particularly since, and this gets into the whole question of corruption, which is another thing we talked about talking about, which we can do. But the culture of theft of people in the government is so ingrained now in Russia that Putin was very misinformed about how powerful his military was. And there had been all this talk about the reform of the Soviet military, the Russian military from the Soviet doctrines, and how there was all this money spent and so forth. And as it turns out, none of that happened basically, and the money went to Swiss bank accounts of generals because they were just corrupt like everybody else. And so when it came time to do this invasion of Ukraine, uh, Putin thought that he could do it in 3 days. And of course, as we all know, the convoy got stuck on the way to Kiev because they ran out of gas. They hadn't thought about logistics, which is the first thing you think about. And so again, I say all this for several reasons, but to go back to the theme of how astonishingly ineffective the bureaucracy is in Russia. And so when you look at that attack that happened, what you're looking at is a failure um, of their system to listen to what's going on and to take preventative action. And the U.S. warned them, a few days before that this was going to happen. I mean, these even countries that are at odds with each other, they maintain channels of communication. Apparently, the Russians didn't answer, or they were so incompetent that they couldn't do anything about it. I mean, the Russians didn't listen, or they were so incompetent that they couldn't do anything about it. So you have this attack. And what this attack means is that it is an enormous loss of face for Putin. He has been trying to blame it on Ukraine. He can't really do that, and everybody knows that. So there's no other alternative impression or interpretation except that they screwed up. They did not do their job of protecting the Russian people. And this is right after an election that Putin claims to have won with a landslide 86% or whatever it is. So it's becoming very apparent within Russia and obviously outside Russia that Putin's it's sort of like the emperor's new clothes for one thing, but also that his regime is fragile, and we know his military is fragile. Now, what they have is the staying power that Ukraine doesn't, because it's a much larger population, and they have just thrown people at this, and the number of dead bodies that they leave, and the Ukrainians are picking up and burying on the battlefield in Ukraine is astonishing. And so you're looking at someone who's burning through the resources he has, who never had the resources he thought he did, and who is feeling threatened and cornered in every way. And it makes him very dangerous. He has threatened the use of tactical nuclear weapons. That would bring a whole bunch of really almost cataclysmic, even if there was just one used, it triggers certain things to happen, like stopping the insurance on all commercial aircraft travel. Commercial aircraft operations, whether it's for travel or shipping. So you can imagine everything just stops at once, and so forth. So it is. I interpret it as something that is going to make him more frightened, more bold in the way that a cornered animal gets, and could very much bounce into the Ukrainian conflict in a very unfortunate way. And Ukraine is not gaining ground at the moment. For one thing, we're not supplying what they really need, and that's a part of so there's this game that goes on, and I think most people aren't aware of in the conflict diplomatic world, which is about restraining things. So Putin uses the threat of nuclear weapons to keep the West from from supplying really the arms that they should have early on. And it's called deterrence. I mean, everybody knows that word, and it works both directions. And it's a kind of cat and mouse game. But so Putin feels the odds evening, the playing field evening. Whether that's true or not, he feels that. The U.S. is now politically divided about supporting Russia, and we didn't support them early enough and quickly enough because we were worried about what Putin would do, which was a accurate worry. I mean, it was a legitimate worry, and so now we're running out of material. We're running out of ammunition, basically, because we've just depleted the stocks, and we have not over the years, the last few years, everybody thought there was a peace dividend, and then we used a lot of it up in the Middle East, and we haven't replenished it fast enough, and we're in a situation where now in the Red Sea, the Houthis can use drones that cost a few $1,000s, and the only defense the U.S. has is using missiles that cost about $3 million or more. For each one drone that's a few $1,000s, it takes a missile. The U.S. could use lasers, but this is another classic example of bureaucratic problems in the U.S. The Navy has not installed many of them because the Naval Budgetary Office has no way to cost out the expected cost because they've never had lasers. So the U.S. Navy can't have lasers because it's never had lasers. I mean, this is the kind of ridiculous thing that goes on. And I say all that just to emphasize how complex these problems are and how they're multiply connected, meaning that if you do one thing here, it affects something over there, and that affects something else, and then that bounces back to affect the first thing. And so, the kind of simplistic answers that people would love for there to be simply don't exist. And I think that a lot of people, obviously they wish they did, but a lot of people don't want to believe that they don't. And this then relates to the rise of strongman authoritarian types who claim that the simple solutions do exist. I'll stop there, but you can see
Yeah.
how when you start to open this Pandora's box, it's full of all sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to unpack there. It sounds like Putin is sort of a victim of his own creation in a sense, where he's not getting accurate information about the strength of his military and whatnot, um, and is convinced about this land grab, which is kind of interesting. One thought I had when you were going through that sort of description of the situation, which was great, is how there's all this talk about Hunter Biden and people in America messing around in Ukraine. It sounds to me like Ukraine was just as sort of kleptocratically corrupt as Russia. Is that an accurate statement?
It is, although I would say that maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, it was at a 9, and Russia was at a 10. But yes, it was absolutely. And of course, the thing is that you can't believe anything that's being weaponized by American politicians who are corrupt in their own way, on
Yeah.
either side. But definitely, Ukraine and Russia are very culturally similar. This is what's so ironic about the whole situation, because until the first war happened in 2014, when they, went into eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainians were quite fond of the Russians, and they shared the culture. And there was a Tchaikovsky Street in Kiev named after the Russian composer, and so forth and so on. And the of course, it's been true throughout history that the people you hate the most are the ones that are most like you. And as we saw in the Middle Ages in Europe over and over. But I think the Russians resented the fact that the Ukrainians were a lot like them, but not actually them. And I mean, to unpack that would it would take somebody who knows more about it than I do, first of all, and it would take a full day to even get started on it. But it's very complex. And Ukraine, but to answer your question, yes, Ukraine is not without an enormous amount of kleptocratic uh, and corrupt activities.
Yeah. What do you think, like sitting here now, what do you think the U.S. policy should be towards
Well,
Ukraine? Should we continue to fund them, or what do you think?
The first thing I would say is that I'm glad I'm not in charge of it, because it's a knotty problem. Um, there's the should be and the will be, and we should continue to fund them, I think, and we should. That's my personal opinion, and we should do so at a level that allows them to prevail in the sense that they stop Russia from moving in. Because a person like Putin, if he succeeds in Ukraine, he's going to have other places on his hit list. And some of those places will be within NATO. And that's an unmitigated disaster, because unless the U.S. just abrogates the treaty, and everybody else does too, an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all NATO members, and you're obligated to defend them. And that's Article 5 of NATO. And if they were to attack one of the Baltic states, Lithuania, say, we would be obligated. They're part of NATO now. We would be obligated to defend them, and that would put us into direct conflict instead of indirect conflict with Russia. So I think leaving. I really am not sure I even understand um, why there are so many Americans who are now in favor of not supporting Ukraine. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. I mean, I understand what they say, but it doesn't. It's nonsensical to me because of what I just mentioned. Um, so what we should do is yes, we should. We're going to be constrained anyway because of what I just mentioned about the amount of material we have, and having to reserve some, and having to now fight a two-front war, one with the Ukraine as a proxy, if you want to put it that way, but we're supplying munitions to them, and then one in the Red Sea that we're actively involved in. And so I think that that's a constraint anyway. Even if we wanted to do it, we would be somewhat constrained. And what we will do, I mean, who knows? It's going to depend a lot on what happens in November here. And, uh, it's certainly, even if you know, the president wanted to stop the deliveries, that would be litigated and so forth, but it would effectively slow it down so much that you would have stopped it for a while, and that could give Russia the upper hand. I'm sorry I can't
Yeah,
give you a better answer than that, but that's the way I see
no,
things.
I like that answer. I'm kind of with you. I feel like we should continue to help the Ukrainians as much as we possibly can, and we should learn from this. You mentioned some things in earlier in this conversation that American military people and even just regular American citizens should keep their mind on, because the Ukraine war is teaching us a couple things that are kind of scary, which is like, man, these conflicts are incredibly costly in terms of the way that material gets used up and destroyed, and it's also the casualty numbers, if we can believe them, they're crazy. It's like all the American casualties in 15 years in Vietnam have happened in less than 2 years or something like that. The numbers are staggering, at least on the Russian side,
Yeah,
which is scary.
it
It seems
is.
like
It
the
is
drones.
horrific.
Yeah, I see these videos. On Twitter. Who knows if they're fake or not? But I see these videos of these drones just like vaporizing, multi-million-dollar tanks and other vehicles and stuff. And it just seems like it's a type of warfare that we aren't really prepared for, psychologically, at least here in America. The Ukrainians are, now that they've been in it for several years, but the rest of the world just doesn't get it yet, and it's scary. And so we should keep our mind on
Well, this
what.
is
Go ahead.
asymmetric warfare. I would say, I've just to take 2 minutes to talk about it. Most Americans still have the idea that that warfare is what it used to be, or what it used to seem to be. But asymmetric warfare is what I just mentioned, where you can use a very cheap drone that can take out a ship if it hits the right way. And the only way to defend it is with a multi-million-dollar missile. That is asymmetric warfare, and it also has a lot to do with irregular warfare. not fighting in units that are organized in the way that classical military doctrine would tell you they would be. And the thing about asymmetric warfare is that it greatly advantages the small players. And the small they're called non-state actors, and it goes across multiple domains. The so-called kinetic war, the war of things hitting other things, missiles and drones, and so forth, is in fact the least scary, because you've also got cyber attacks, which happen at an enormous frequency and are often non-state actors. There are three categories: they're criminals, they're non-state actors, and then there are states, and often the non-state actors are funded by states as proxies, and almost like privateers in the 18th century. They're acting under the flag of a state, but you don't know that. And then there's bio warfare, bio error and bioterror. Now, bioerror is more of a state problem, where something gets out that's not supposed to. But bioterror is, we're now getting to the point where, with very little money, a few tens of thousands of dollars, somebody can genetically engineer a virus in a garage that could, theoretically at least, take out millions of people. So, and that all falls under the category of asymmetric warfare. So a little unit, a little person going after and effectively going after something much larger. And it's a real risk right now, a huge risk.
Yeah. That bio thing is terrifying. God, I don't even want to think about that. This reminds me, Dan Carlin is one of my favorite podcasters. He has a show called Hardcore History, and he's done a bunch on World War II. And he was talking about what happened in the early part of that conflict was that the big powers realized that their battleship fleets were like, they weren't useless, but they basically were incredibly vulnerable to aircraft carrier and airplanes coming in and just taking them out with one attack. And they were like really expensive. And I feel like that's sort of what we're learning right now, which is like, yeah, we might have this incredible fleet of aircraft carriers and the best planes on the planet, but if these inexpensive drones that are available to even non-state actors, like you mentioned, could take them out, fly a bunch of drones at an aircraft carrier and blow up the hull, and then we lose. How many billions of dollars go down in that one attack? It's kind of frightening to think about
Yeah.
the implications of
Not,
that.
yeah, not to mention hypersonic, guided hypersonic missiles, which, China has been working very hard on, or so they say, and they seem to have had some success. And just to clarify, um, ICBMs, nuclear missiles, they're hypersonic too, but they go on a ballistic trajectory. So you can guide some of the reentry vehicles, but you can't guide the missile. But a hypersonic guided missile you can guide it around the Earth in an unpredictable pattern and then strike something. That's just for everybody's information, because I think there's some confusion on that. But yes, a non-nuclear hypersonic missile can destroy an aircraft carrier, and there's it is potentially the case that there's not a whole lot we can do about it right now, because they move so fast and they're undetectable, because they could be guided and have unpredictable patterns. It's a real problem, and so you did have in the past people in foreign militaries and foreign governments, their attitude, let's say 15, 20 years ago, was, well, you just don't want to tangle with the Americans because you'll have your ass handed to you. You just don't want to tangle with them. And they're too powerful, they're too advanced. What's happened over the last couple of decades is that everybody's caught up, or a lot of people have caught up, and also they've found these things that are much cheaper and can disadvantage the old technology. So, it used to be that you could quell a war by sailing an aircraft carrier up to a country, and some flyovers with F-16s or whatever. Now it's just people just raise their eyebrows at it. I mean, they're still concerned about it, but they think, okay, if we tangle with them, there's a chance we might prevail, and so it's dramatic. I mean, there are lots of ways to look at this. I mean, one way to look at it is that instead of spending the money to update our systems, we spent the money to fight these useless wars in the Middle East, and that's my interpretation. I think particularly Iraq, but the amount of money that's spent, if that had gone into simply, you know, military preparedness, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in today. But yes, there's the kinds of big picture things like battleships and aircraft carriers and carrier battle groups and all that are becoming less useful and less relevant. And that this is a real fear about the invasion of potential invasion of Taiwan by China. Is that the figures I've seen, the loss of both sides of their aircraft and ships in the first 3 weeks is astonishing. It's like Ukraine. It's just hundreds of thousands perhaps of aircraft gone, 20-30% of your fleet. So it's getting to where wars are too, they've always been too terrible to fight, and I think we're learning again that they're too terrible to fight. But you keep having these actors who want to fight them, so it forces you into this, and this leads into the whole thing about authoritarian actors. That's another direction to go. But let me stop there.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to close the loop on one thing. Who has these hypersonic missiles right now? Does anyone have them to the where they're functional?
The Chinese claim to, the Russians claim to. I would be circumspect about those claims. And the Americans claim they can't make it work, and I would be circumspect about that too, because it can be useful to say you don't have something when you do. So, but beyond China, Russia, and the US, it's very unlikely that anybody has them right now. They're too technically difficult to build and to operate, and you also have to have basically a global navigation system at your command. I mean, there's just reasons why, maybe at short distances, but the true hypersonic guided missiles are going to be. It's just those three countries right now. Now, India could probably do it,
Yeah.
but I haven't seen any data that said that they were anywhere close to doing that.
Okay, got it. Before we leave the subject of Russia and Ukraine, one question that's been on my mind is there a circumstance or where China would actually get involved in that conflict in some capacity, either as like an international attempt to stop it or to support one side or the other? What's your take on China's potential role in this thing?
There are scenarios where they would be involved, and they already are involved in some ways. They're involved by essentially tacitly approving or not disapproving of China's involvement. Um, and they're involved sub rosa in supplying things, which we have evidence of, but it's not out there. But yes, they are involved, and the Chinese Russian relationship is fickle right now. It's very strong, but there have been past periods in the past where it hasn't been, and it could turn on a dime. And Putin is essentially making himself into a vassal state of China, because he is the weak partner. I mean, except for the number of nuclear missiles that he has, and we don't frankly know how many of those work, because they haven't had the money to keep the missiles are hard to maintain. I mean, nuclear missiles, and this is one of the things that's kept so many countries from getting them, because they have to be maintained, and it's expensive and difficult. And so, but nevertheless, he has a very formidable nuclear arsenal. And but other than that, I mean, he's got oil, um, he's got grain, he's got some things, but the economy as a whole is is nothing like China's. And for one thing, they've had so much brain drain, and for the other thing, there's such corrupt businesses. They're like gangster businesses. And if you look at that kind of business, they want simple businesses that they can understand and control, like the oil business, like growing avocados in Mexico, kidnapping, all those sorts of things. And that is a specific kind of situation that leads you to essentially not be able to develop the tech elements that you could otherwise develop. And of course, in Russia's case, there was already a brain drain, and now there's been an enormous brain drain since the Ukraine war because nobody wants to get drafted. And so anybody who could, or many people who could, have left to go into a country that where they've got some protection from that, or complete protection from it. So they're indisposed to. They created a system that is indisposed to allowing them to do high tech things to begin with, and now they've made it worse by the political choices they've made. But again, these what I call gangster economies, they're very much based on simple businesses, and so you will find those businesses prevailing in countries like that, as opposed to high tech businesses, which are inimical to that system, or that system is inimical to them.
Yep. And so Putin basically needs the Chinese to fill that massive void in his economy,
He does.
essentially.
And of course, the other thing that's so ironic about this is that, now the North Koreans and the Iranians are selling selling things to Russia to keep the war going in Ukraine, and those are. I mean, Russia has never liked either one of those countries except as as kind of an ally of necessity, and the idea that you've got what's called a middle power, Iran, and even a less than middle power, uh, North Korea, although albeit nuclear, is supplying Russia is highly ironic for any of us who followed Russia for a long time and listened to their, all their grandiose ideas and so forth.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, we sort of we began to touch on this other conflict a little bit when you mentioned sort of asymmetric warfare and what's happening with in the Red Sea. But another thing that I really wanted to get your take on is, what the American policy should be with respect to the war in Gaza. I know this is kind of like a tricky topic, but I feel like we can't ignore it if we want to survey the world and discuss all the most important issues. So, what's your take on that?
Another complex situation. I think you have to, again, I don't think any of these things are comprehensible without the backstory. And um, that's a very long backstory, and I'm not going to go into all of it. But I do think that it's important to realize that the leadership of Hamas is on the record more than 10 years ago, really close to 20 years ago, of saying, look, we know that the uh, most of Palestinian population would settle for peace in a day. And what we have to do is keep them riled up, keep them radicalized. And I think that's factor number one. And this is on the record, the someone who's in a very high position in the UK now has publicly said that she was a journalist and she interviewed that fellow who was actually killed a few months ago by an Israeli missile in Beirut, and that's what he said. And so that's factor number one, that you've got them, you've got a certain mindset, and they know that unless they keep things, all shook up, as they say, then the people will move away from their position. And the second element of that is that uh, the the Abraham Accords, which were signed between three parties, Saudi in when was it, last year before last, I guess, including Israel, and have had a real salutary effect on peace and so forth in the Middle East. That was a direct threat to them because they were afraid that the parties um, to the Abraham Accords were going to increase, and that they were going to simply solve the problem of the West Bank and Gaza, and it would be out of Hamas' hands. And so I think there was movement to do that. They were correct. That was what coming down the pike, and it may still happen. And it's very interesting to see that none of the major parties in the Middle East, even including Iran, have been trying to make this into a wider war. They've been trying not to make it into a wider war for many reasons, but um, the uh, the need that Hamas felt to keep this pressure on was a big reason why they mounted this attack. And so, you have they done what they wanted? You know, I, Obviously none of us knows, but they have certainly, made it into a highly conflicted situation, and they've turned the world against Israel to a large extent because of what Israel um, did in response. And this is something you have to realize about terrorism and indeed about extremism. And I think it's often misinterpreted. Their goals are not to necessarily achieve what we would call a military objective, take over some land or whatever, destroy a building. Sometimes it is, but those things are mere ways of exciting a change in the dynamic. So when Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda blew up the Twin Towers, it wasn't. I mean, the Twin Towers, yes, they were a symbol of internationalism and trade and all that stuff, but it wasn't about that. Well, if we can just get the Twin Towers down, then we're. It was to incite the U.S. to do, in fact, what the U.S. did do: invade the Middle East and make a new generation of enemies. Because what you had that went on, the U.S. would send a missile to destroy a building in, let's say, Baghdad, and the missile would hit the building, destroy whoever they were after, and somebody's mother was walking by and she gets a shard of glass in her neck and dies, and then you've created an enemy for life of all of her children. And so that kind of, they knew that was going to happen, and so that and indeed it did. And I think that the reason that uh, that Hamas did what it did was similarly to provoke Israel, and they did. And now the Israelis who were attacked, and it was legitimate that they responded to that, have now responded so vigorously that they're turning everyone against them. And of course the other thing is that, and this gets into a fascinating social element that's not part of this particular part of the discussion, but so much of it's been televised now, and people see so much. The transparency has changed everything, because wars were always awful, and victims of wars were always, their ears were cut off and force fed to them, or that sort of thing. But now you see it, and that has changed a whole bunch of things. I think it's changed the way we understand ourselves as humans, but it's also changed opinion on these conflicts. And so now you have global opinion very much moving against Israel, whereas at first I think there was a sympathy for them because they were the ones that were attacked and people were killed at concerts and all this stuff that was not justifiable. But now they've gone so far overboard that it's having a repercussion. So my feeling is that Israel is going to continue to do what they're doing for a while, and that then when they're satisfied that they have removed the Hamas capabilities or damaged the Hamas capabilities in southern Gaza, they've done that in northern Gaza, and they've flooded, all these network of tunnels and all that sort of. When they've done that in southern Gaza, then they will probably be ready to go to the peace table, and there won't be anything left of Gaza. And you've got millions of people who are, essentially facing famine. And again, it's a very complex situation. But I don't think it's going to end tomorrow. However much pressure the U.S. puts on, unless you get a different president, a different leader in Israel, and then it could. But I think that Netanyahu's pretty set in his ways about, and of course it's his, in many ways it's their failure to not have detected this, not have paid attention to it when the signs were there, and they knew the signs were there, and they didn't, just like Moscow with the attack on the theater, they didn't pay attention, and so now we all face the consequence of a much more troubled war, of which a direct consequence is the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. So you see, these things they're all connected.
Israel is going through what we in America went through in the war on terror, but at a more rapid clip. Like America had this golden period in terms of its international reputation and the sympathy that we got in the aftermath of 9/11. And then we eventually sort of ruined that moment by invading Iraq under false pretenses. And kind of everybody knows that story. But what's happened in Israel is in a very short amount of time, because of the probably the modern communications technology, like you mentioned, and the fact that everyone can see what's happening, the narrative for Israel has completely flipped from one of raw sympathy and love and support to questions, and that's been interesting to watch play out. And it kind of makes you wonder whether that, like you sort of intimated or said in your response, makes you wonder whether that was part of the plan. Like they had to have known, right? You go and you kidnap a bunch of innocent people. They had to have known Israel was going to respond, and maybe this was their grand plan.
I think I mean, if you ask me, I think it was in both cases. um, um, Al Qaeda in 2001 and Hamas there. I think it was part of their plan to provoke. It's like sticking an animal with a stick, and eventually it's going to come back. And if they want that, because it legitimizes their presence, it justifies their presence, and this is becomes a personal thing, as so many of these things do. A lot of leaders would, they reach a point where they'd prefer not to be in that situation, but they don't want to be in jail or dead, so they'd rather provoke something and keep the legitimacy, keep the rationale for their being there. And yeah, I think that's right. I think that is what they did. And it's very easy for states to fall into these traps. There's an interesting thing. A lot of people don't know this, I think, but I mean, it's out there in open source now. But um, there was a plan that the U.S. military came up with after 9/11 to use special forces and simply go in and take out all these nodes of terrorist operation, of extremist operation. And that's what the military wanted to do. They did not want to invade Iraq or Afghanistan. And there were even contacts among, uh, you know, nations that were unfriendly, like Iran, who said, "Yeah, we don't really want these people either. We'll help you take them out." And the U.S. wanted to make, as states do, a big impression, and show people that they didn't need to tangle with us. And so that plan was never pursued. But think what a different world we'd be in now if it had been.
Yeah, that would have been a totally different couple of decades. Because I've actually had several ex-military veterans on the program and who fought in the war on terror, and they've been pretty, consistently negative about their own experiences and their thoughts on how far we lost sort of the moral high ground of a great nation during that conflict. And had they followed that program, man, it would have been totally different. Because yeah, nobody wants these terrorists in their country. That makes sense to me. It's too bad we didn't go down that road.
It is really too bad. But this is the problem with political leadership. And I'm not saying we should have a military leadership either. I'm just saying, that it like everything, it becomes self-serving, and people get their ire up, and get their they want to be seen to be showing power, and they want to be seen to be angry and doing things, and it's you hear the expression, use it or lose it. It's also possible that you use it and lose it, which is what I think the U.S. did. They had the moral high ground, and they used it in the wrong way, and now that we've lost it. And that's country after country, and often, well, it has to do with many factors. But in the case of Russia, for example, it just has to do with one person's fetishistic focus on a certain interpretation and the people around him, and his misinformation about how strong his military actually was.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we could talk about these wars and potential wars all day, but there's some other topics that we have to get on the table
Sure.
before you go. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot and want to get your take on is it seems like we're in the midst of some kind of global migration crisis. Here in this country, it's all in the news every day about the border security and the millions of people and the millions of encounters that we're having. But this is not just a US problem. There's migration issues in Europe and all over the place. And I feel like, I forget which historian said this, but there was a historian who said essentially like migration is the engine of history. And it feels like history is happening now as a result of this. But what's your take on these hot spots, and what can we do about them, or what should we do about them?
Migration is definitely the engine of history, no question. And if you look at the great historical events, the fall of the Roman Empire, for example, they're very often the ultimate cause is migration, or it plays a big part in it. And one could get into a whole bunch of things about that, but yes, I think we are at the very beginning of a major migration crisis, and I think that it's going to be the proximate cause, or maybe even the ultimate cause is going to be resources and climate change. And the climate is changing. I mean, people can debate on why, but that doesn't really matter when you're facing the consequences of it. And as regions dry up and desertification happens, and as resources are no longer there, uh, people are going to move. Because if you have nothing to eat, or even nothing to eat and nothing to drink, what do you have to lose? You have nothing to lose. The second thing, though, is the conflictual elements that are everywhere now. So we're getting back to war, but and those are within countries, and and they're between countries, and between countries and non-state actors, as we talked about. So when you put all that together, you find that people are driven out of their homes, which they would rather stay in. By the way, they would rather stay in their homes, but they're driven out by simply intolerable conditions. And so what do? They vote with their feet. They just move. And it's an extremely difficult problem to deal with, because it itself becomes part of uh, a system of, let's say, corruption or crime, in the sense that there are people who are more than willing, for the right amount of money, to help you get from point A to point Z. And a friend of mine did a fascinating study and bit of research on what happens in the Americas. And there's a kind of, you could call it an underground railroad that goes from, the southern cone, and particularly Chile, all the way up the spine of Western South America, into Central America, across the Darien Gap, through the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, and then I'm sorry, and Honduras, and then through Mexico, and then into the U.S. And the way this works is very interesting, because every single town where these people go through, they move through. This is very organized, by the way, and it's expensive. Most of these people are middle class, because it costs $30,000 to $50,000 to get yourself moved, or to get one person moved up this chain. But everybody who is every town, the police chief and the mayor and various city officials get a little bit of money for every person who goes through. So, and that goes not only up to, but through the U.S.-Mexico border and into the U.S. So that is integrated into now the economic system. Those people rely on that money. And how do you dislodge that? And that something like that system is going to evolve everywhere. It has already, but her work was groundbreaking, because it exposed how this really happens. And as long as there's some enterprising entrepreneur, there's going to be a way for these people to move. All borders are porous. No
Yeah.
border is impervious, and the various communist states found that out. You can make it more difficult or less difficult, but A, no border is impervious, and B, you talk about losing the moral high ground. What are we going to do with all these people? And by the way, these are not people just from Latin America. There are people from all over the world who have the means to fly into Santiago, Chile, or someplace like that, and then pay for themselves to be taken up this thing, and then end up at a lot of them at the border of Texas and Mexico. And what are you going to do about it? It's we're going to face some really difficult decisions. But yes, the other side of the coin is that the only reason, or the major reason, that the U.S. is not facing the demographic crises that China and Japan and Europe are facing is because we have so many immigrants who are younger. Americans don't want to have kids now the way they did. They just, they figured out that you can have a lot better lifestyle if you only have one, or if you have none. And so, where is the labor going to come from? And we're still the place everybody wants to come. So we benefit from that. Now, I'm very well aware that people have huge cultural fears of it, and I think that those are. It's interesting living in Texas about this, because we don't. Hispanic culture is so much a part of Texas. If there's a national drink in Texas, it's a margarita made with tequila, which can only be made in Mexico, and so forth and so on. And there, people, the populations are so integrated in marriage. And my daughter is adopted, and she's Hispanic, and so it's not even among among all different branches of political belief in Texas. It's very rare to find someone who is anti-Hispanic, or who doesn't just see it as part of our culture. And indeed, there's rationale for that, which is that if you can drive from the Yukon to Tierra del Fuego, and you can read all the signs, the culture's familiar, there are churches and courts and all these things that it's all a part of Western culture. And they're different. There are parts that came from Northern Europe and parts that came from Southern Europe, but it's all part of the same cultural milieu. And that's not the case in immigration in Europe, because and I'm not making any value judgment, but it's an alien civilization. You can't read the way they write unless you learn to do it. They have different value systems, radically different value systems. They have different religion, and so forth and so on. So the Europeans face a much different kind of problem than we do. However, because of what I mentioned, because so many people are coming from other places that are not Latin America. I don't think we have any problem with Latin American migration, but I think that what we're now seeing is, because I think it's the same culture, and we need their abilities. But what we're now seeing is people from these other places flying to Latin America and then taking this train up, to and through the U.S. border, and that's not to criticize them at all, but they do represent a cultural variance that's different from the much more minor cultural variance that Latin Americans represent,
Yeah.
or essentially no cultural variance in the case of a place like Texas. And so, again, it's a very complex situation, and it's going to be very difficult to deal with and maintain our moral high ground. Now, there's some politicians who could care less about maintaining the moral high ground. But that makes us not America, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like this is an area of policy that is sort of make or break for our future. Like we have to kind of get back to our roots and establish an immigration policy that's like productive and proactive and focused. Um, I was thinking too, we've already learned from history that walls don't work. Like the Romans messed around with walls and spent a lot of money on walls all over the empire, and it didn't work. And the Chinese as well. And so I feel like we don't need to relearn that lesson, and we just need to get better on policy. But I wanted to share with you. I spoke with a woman who is has been doing humanitarian work on the in the camps that started as a result of the Remain in Mexico policy. And she anecdotally, like, absolutely verified what you just discussed, which is that the sort of makeup, the demographic makeup of the people who are attempting to come into this country varies widely. And there's a lot of affluent people from places like China and even Ukraine and all over the world who are putting themselves on that track that goes through the Darien Gap and putting them in very dangerous positions. Like it's very common for women to be sexually assaulted. You need bribe money along the way. It's really dangerous, but they're willing to do it because situations around the world are so bad and they're getting worse. Like we just spent an hour talking about a couple of them that are worse and worse every day. And so I feel like this is an issue that's going to be with us for quite some time, and it has consequences for our country for sure. You still there?
Yeah, I missed you said this is an issue that is going to be with us, and then it cut out for some reason.
Oh, okay, yeah, and it's going to have consequences for our country because it's not going to go away. There's no magic formula. Like we're not going to build a wall and this thing's going to go away. We have to come up with an intelligent policy solution to make the most of this and to be American and to embrace the values that we've had for 200 and some odd years and help people that need help and help our country along the way.
Yeah, I think that the thing that is blocking being able to do those things is fear of change. And because it does imply change, and you know change has always happened, and it always will happen, but there is there's a lot of negative energy, emotion about change and I think it there's several things to say about this. First of all, change is happening so fast across all domains now, and we are not actually evolved to deal with that. It's very threatening to everybody. I mean, what technological change, demographic change, climate change, every kind of change, and it's overwhelmed people, and that's true not only of just every person, but it's overwhelmed governments and decision makers and scholars and so forth. Um, and that has led to nostalgia. And that nostalgia is usually for an imagined past, a perfect, but there's been enormous amount of study that humans don't actually remember things well. And we don't actually know what happened in the past. We only have accounts of the past. So in a way, we're kind of blind, but we have these ideas, these conceptual frameworks that, oh well, the past was like this, and when there were only it was only us, it was so much better. And this is not just true in the U.S., by the way. I talked to a woman in Egypt who said, I don't even recognize my own country, and that's Egypt. And from our standpoint, it hadn't changed much, but from her standpoint, it had. And so, it's the global, uh, increasingly fast change in all circumstances that I think has produced fear, and that then produces all these feedback loops where people are desperate to to get a handle on it and to stop it. And one way that looks easy is not to allow the demographics to change, and that feeds into something that's always been present in human society, which is a desire. The other is potentially an enemy. In a lot of primitive societies, if you're hunting and you run into somebody who's not from your tribe, the first thing you do is talk about who you know and who you're related to, in the hopes that you find one relation, so that you don't have to fight. The fighting is the usual outcome if you can't relate to each other. So we're programmed by millions of years of evolution in the savannah and everywhere else to fear the other. And we've now built a world in which the other is always present. And so it's there are going to be some hurdles to overcome. It requires a different mental attitude, and I think that's what the post-war system, liberal international order, whatever you, that's one of the things it was trying to do, was to get everybody to get along so that they could, and see that if they made economics the most important element, then they could justify being with, quote, the other, and not fear the other so much, because everybody could make money. Well, it's turned out that that's not as convincing to people as the post-war theorists thought it would be. And so we're back to the future in a way. We're back to the kinds of things that we've done for millennia, and it's a real problem. I mean, it just, again, until you unpack these things, you come up with these solutions that look like they're great, and then you understand, well, wait a minute, this is a problem. This is a problem. That's not to say there are no solutions. It's just to say that it is foolish in the extreme to think you can come up with some simple solution to a problem that's so complex and so hardwired, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure. And it doesn't help that the last like several decades we've been sort of dumbing down our political dialogue in this country, but around the world. It's not just an American problem, and people aren't having these in-depth conversations enough, because it takes a lot. There's no soundbite about Ukraine. There's no soundbite about Israel, right?
That's
You
right.
have to actually understand in some detail what the heck is going on, but to even form an intelligent opinion, and even then, you've got to question yourself several times, to make sure, because it's really complicated.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, and our leaders are sort of following. Unfortunately, they're following the technology. And so rather than standing forth and saying, you know what, I'm not going to dumb my message down, they're just trying to get the masses to support them. And so they're along for the ride. So they're on TikTok or whatever and doing the exact same thing that entertainers are doing. And
Yep.
they should be talking like we've been talking.
Yeah, and the technology has allowed them to see what sells and what doesn't, and they instantly go to what sells,
Yeah.
and and so and that of course intensifies it. It's a cycle, um, and so yeah, I mean, the whole thing about leadership right now is very distressing because I mean, leadership is a trust. Ideally, it's that you believe this group of people, you know, can be relied upon to make the best decisions. And I think that trust is eroding, or maybe it's already eroded in the kind of leaders we have today, because they're not doing a good job. And this is true everywhere. There are plenty of Chinese who are very angry about Xi Jinping's, um, bellicose desires to go to war and everything. They don't want to do it. And I think that it gets to another issue, which I have been forced to conclude, and I don't, and this is going to lead somewhere. I don't know where it's going to lead, and that is that the systems that we have, the incumbent old systems, the existing systems that we have, are just, they're not fit for purpose. They no longer are relevant to the conditions that we are in, which result from all this change. And so, you've got this, the way I look at it is you've got this continuum of, capitalism, socialism, communism. They're all Western systems. They're all part of the same, you can, it's like a dial. You can turn it all the way here or all the way there. And there are all these positions. I think maybe that entire continuum is no longer relevant. And I could get into the reasons for that, but what do we do if if that's the case? For the purpose of argument, grant me that let's say it's not it is the case that the existing structures we have can't actually deal with the changes that have occurred and are occurring and are about to occur. What do we do? And this is where the fear gets its most intense, I think, because if people feel like then they're thrown in the water, well, then they've got to grab back to something. Even if it doesn't work, they want something stable and old and that they can depend on and can understand. And that's maybe the worst thing to do. But it's not an easy problem to solve.
Yeah, not at all. And I spoke to somebody recently, a young man who's heavily in the AI world, and he presented a vision for me of such radical change that, your statement about like maybe these systems that we have, like voting and proportional representation and capitalism, all this stuff that we sort of take for granted, like he was so bullish on AI and the economic potential. He thought money in our lifetime was going to be a useless notion because everything was going to be free and we're going to have mass abundance. Like he presented this vision for me of a world that it doesn't even make sense in the framework that I grew up in, which is essentially like the liberal order, the neoliberal order, where people have where scarcity is sort of the main issue, and it's a question of how you deal with scarcity and what the system looks like. And the change, I don't know if I agree with him. I just bring it up to say that I think you're right that the change that we've already experienced and we're about to experience is fundamental, and it could change everything, including the way in which we conduct our countries.
I both agree and disagree with your description of what he says. First of all, I'm very suspicious. In fact, I disbelieve any utopian notions because people have always had them and they always end up in tears. They end up in worse than tears. They end up horribly. I mean, every single time. And so I don't believe that, but I do believe that it represents radical change. I mean, we're living. I think Hariri pointed this out. We're living in the first time in which we don't know what jobs are going to look like 10 years from now. We don't know, and that's a big change from what we used to know, and it's the next part of a whole change, a series of changes that the future is not going to be like the past, and that's It's we have this thing called near term bias or near past bias, which we think that, well, yesterday was this way, so tomorrow's going to be the same way. And in philosophy, it's called the problem of induction. And the problem is that things are the same until they aren't. And now the changes, the becoming different, is happening so fast. But I would add to AI, and we could talk an hour about that. It's a fascinating topic. I'm not a believer in it in as being intelligent or sentient, but I do believe, as Daniel Dennett said, that the real problem with it is that it can fool us into thinking it's intelligent or sentient, and therefore can be used by bad actors to manipulate people. But it's a big change, whatever it is. So you've got that, and then you've got the change associated with climate change, and you've got changes associated with demographics and changes associated with migration, and all this together becomes an overwhelming amount of change. And I think that's why the future has become so unpredictable. Not 10 years from now, not even 5 years from now, but a year from now. And people, we're just, as I said before, we are not engineered, we are not evolved to deal with that kind of thing, because while things would happen fast, you would get eaten by a lion immediately, and a volcano would erupt. For the most part, life on the savannah was the same for generations. And you knew, okay, grandfather said that this was the spring that was safe to drink from, and your great 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 grandchildren were still drinking from it, and it was still safe. And that's our mentation. And so we've now thrown ourselves into a situation which is totally alien to that. And I just fundamentally, if you're looking for not just proximate causes but ultimate causes, I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, well said. It's you take that list of the five things that you just articulated, um, AI and climate change and migration and demographics, and man, it's. I have kids. I have an 8-year-old, 6-year-old, and I think about this every day because I feel it personally just talking to people like you and the other guests I've had. Like this is something that's top of mind for everyone. People, even people who are like highly successful mid-career executives, are worried about like, hey, how am I going to make money in 10 years from now? How am I going to pay for college? They're paying for high school or something now. Yeah, it's a really scary proposition.
Yeah. They are, and I have a 2-year-old granddaughter, so I'm right in the boat with you. Um,
Yeah.
but and you're right. There, I addressed a client, which is a large multinational company, and was in a room with about 100 of their top level managers, and what they were saying is, we can't perform to budget anymore because we don't know what next year's going to look like. We don't know what's going to be scarce, what's going to not be scarce, what constraints we're going to have, what's going to change. And and they said this is fundamentally different because we just technically cannot perform to budget. So that's so ingrained, is that you've got a budget, you make a plan, and you execute on the plan, and that's going away. So even if they still keep their jobs, which is also a question, because AI is coming for white collar, at least certain white collar jobs. Even if they do, it's it's highly um, divergent from what they will have to do in their job in 3 or 4 years is very different from what they have to do today. So it's pretty terrifying if you're really in any part of it.
Yeah, seriously. Well, I know you've got another appointment coming up, and I want to make sure you have some time to successfully transition from this to that. We probably have to do a follow up because I got about five other topics
Sure.
on my notes here. But this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you for all your time and all these incredible ideas. I'll make sure everyone knows where to find you and your work and whatnot. So, Dee, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure. Really enjoyed the chat and look forward to the next one.
Thanks, man.
Thanks. Bye bye.